Today we're going to be doing low light image quality tests on the A7R3 and the A7IV that we're shooting with right now. And the first thing we're going to be taking a look at is the low light performance of the A7IV and the A7R3. And both of these cameras I was shooting at their default picture profile, so none of the picture profiles, no S-Log3 or S-Cinetone enabled with it, just to make the comparison more fair. And I personally like to use no picture profiles when I'm shooting at really low light locations, because just by limiting the dynamic range you end up getting less noise in the picture. Also, both of these cameras were using the same lens, the Sigma 35mm at f1.4, so we can get the most light as possible. So we're going to be taking a look at those right now, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. So after comparing both of these cameras, I gotta say A7IV does a whole lot better in low light performance when it comes to shooting video. You get like a very clean and usable image out of the A7IV up to like 12,800, I would say. And even after that, when you go to like 32,000, it's still very usable. You know, you get a good image out of it. And things that you can still keep going with this camera. With the A7R3, it stops you from going any higher once you get to 32,000. But with the A7IV, you can go all the way up to 100,000 ISO, and like the image obviously falls apart at that point, but it's still, you know, it's not horrible. So with the A7IV, I would say you can pretty much use it to 12,800 ISO while getting, you know, a good quality image. But with the A7R3, it's, to be honest, like after like 3200, like you still get a clean image, but the color starts shifting with the camera. And once you go to like 6400, I would say that's like the limit, the A7R3. But even at 6400, like there isn't too much noise, but the colors do start shifting to like more of a magenta, which does not look good. And once you go like 12,800, you know, you get a lot of noise in the picture. And things that I shot a lot of stuff professionally with the A7R3, you know, I was shooting at like 12,800, you know, when I used to do videos at bars and restaurants. And you still get like a decent image, but like the A7IV does a whole lot better. First, we're going to compare the long exposure out of both of these cameras. And this is the A7R3 image. And we can see, if we zoom in right here, you know, both of these cameras give you a nice clean image when you're shooting at ISO 100 and doing a long exposure, as you can see right here, compared to the A7IV. But the A7R3 does give you a good amount of more sharpness. Both of these cameras are focused on this house right here, and we can see that the A7R3 is a tiny bit sharper. So for that comparison, A7R3 does win. It does give you cleaner and nicer and sharper images when you're shooting at the base ISO, but you do a long exposure. Now let's take a look at some images taken at high ISO with both of these cameras. This one was taken with the A7R3, and I focused on the Sony sign right here. and this is what it looks like at 32,000 ISO. So very high ISO, and as you can see, it's a usable image, to be honest. You know, this is just lit and just complete darkness with some fairy lights outside, and as you can see, it's a usable image. And then if we go to the A7IV image, it's almost identical, but I would say that the A7IV looks a little bit sharper than the A7R3. Now, when we looked at the last picture, the A7R3 picture looked sharper because the A7R3 image looked sharper because it had more megapixels and it was at the base ISO. But once you go higher up in the ISO, we can see that the Sony A7IV actually ends up becoming sharp just because it does better in higher ISO. So we can clearly see that the A7IV image is sharper. But if we go to like 12,800 and we look at the image, you know, this is what the R3 looks like, decently sharp. And we look at the A7IV, it's still a cleaner and sharper image compared to the R4. So if we're taking any pictures in high ISO, A7IV obviously does better and you get cleaner and sharper results than the R3. But if you're going to be shooting mainly at the base ISO or even just like before 3200 ISO, R3 does perform better. R3 does perform better when taking pictures, but if you're going to go to those high ISOs, the A7IV does seem to do better than the A7R3. So in conclusion, pretty much if you're gonna be doing video or if you're gonna be taking pictures with high ISO, A7IV does perform a lot better than the A7R3. But if you're gonna be shooting on the base ISO and taking a long exposure picture, then the A7R3 does perform better than the A7IV. But this is just a low light test. We're going to be doing a lot of different comparison between